Now we shall look at another important attribute which controls the placement of elements on a web page, namely float. Remember that only static and relatively positioned elements can be floated. The float attribute is useful in placing an element either towards the left or towards the right within its container and allowing other elements to kind of flow around it in the available space, right? So let's look at our web page and hit preview on this. Okay, so what you see here is you have three divs, right, which are all positioned with float left, right? So let's look at the CSS file and the class members. So if you see, look at the class members, you have a float left attribute specified. If you look at the HTML, the same class members is assigned to all three divs. And you have a span which contains some text which sort of flows around these divs as we had just defined, right? Now experiment with this HTML, try and change the CSS, make the value of float right and see what happens. Also try and figure out what happens if you assign float attributes to certain divs and not to certain other divs. For example, you can do something like this to the change me div, right? You can assign float none, right? See what happens when you experiment with different float values. Let's move on to the next step. Here, as we saw in the previous step, that since all these three div elements are floated to the left, the span content flows around it on the right. But what if you do not want that to happen? Well, CSS provides a clear attribute for just that particular case. Now let's show you an example of the clear attribute and see how it works. So I shall show you two examples, one by using the empty line tag. So let me enter a clear attribute with value both. Let's save this and hit preview. So as you can see, the span content no longer flows around the left floated divs. Now since we've used float left for all our divs preceding the span, I can just specify a clear left and that will do the same job for me, right? We can also use an empty div instead of the break tag or the BR tag to achieve the same objective. So let's see what happens if I use a div with clear left. So there you see, we get the same impact. So once again, experiment with this step, right? Just add, remove clear attributes. We can add a clear attribute after the second div or the first div with different float values and see what you get. You can also try and change the position of one of the divs to absolute or fixed and observe the impact. Once again, it's important that you understand how float works and how you can undo the effect of float by using the clear attribute. So experiment as much as you can and till the time you're comfortable with the usage of float and clear.